The crown felt less like a symbol of power and more like a circlet of ice, its cold seeping through her skull to freeze the very thoughts within. Queen Seraphina sat upon the onyx throne of Eldoria, a ruler forged in duty, yet inside she was merely a girl drowning in a sea of silks and secrets. The gazes of her council members were like daggers, each one dissecting her youth, her composure, her right to rule a kingdom teetering on the precipice of war. They called her the Iron Queen, a name meant to inspire fear and respect, but it was a lie. Iron could be shattered. And as she stared out at the rain-streaked windows of the throne room, a single terrifying thought echoed in the lonely chambers of her heart. She was utterly, completely alone, and her kingdom was about to burn. This was her daily reality, a gilded cage where every breath was a calculated political move, and every smile was a mask. The vulturous nobles circled constantly, their whispers of dissent a venomous tide threatening to pull her under. Beyond the castle walls, a ruthless empire amassed its armies, their banners a promise of fire and ruin for her people. She was the shield, the unyielding monarch, but the weight of it all was a physical burden, a crushing pressure on her chest that made it hard to breathe. Her power was a fragile illusion, maintained only by a will that was beginning to fracture. Comenta de dónde nos ves y suscríbete, porque esta historia apenas comienza. Ahora sí, continuemos. This endless performance of strength was her life's work, and the terror of failing was a constant, silent scream behind her serene expression. In the dead of night, when the castle slept, and the ghosts of her ancestors walked the halls, the Iron Queen would melt away. Alone in her chambers, Seraphina would trace the borders of Eldoria on ancient maps, her fingers trembling as they passed over the encroaching territories of the enemy. It was here that the fear was allowed to live. She was too young for this, thrust onto the throne by a tragedy that had stolen her family and her childhood. She was haunted by the weight of their legacy and the crushing knowledge that her every decision was scrutinized not just by her court, but by history itself. She ruled a nation, but she couldn't confide in a single soul, for in her world, vulnerability was a death sentence. The reports from the Eastern Front grew more dire with each passing day. Her generals spoke of strategy and fortification, but their eyes betrayed the truth. Eldoria's armies were not enough. Her council offered only hollow words and self-serving plots, seeing the coming war as an opportunity to seize more power for themselves. Seraphina knew that conventional warfare would lead to her kingdom's annihilation. She needed more than soldiers and steel. She needed a weapon that defied logic, an ally born of the very primal magic her sophisticated court so openly scorned. An idea, wild and desperate, began to take root in the desolate soil of her mind, a solution so dangerous that even considering it felt like treason against her own civilized world. Just as the council meeting adjourned, a tremor of chaos rippled through the court's decorum. The captain of the royal guard approached the throne, his face grim, his posture rigid with urgency. He knelt, his voice a low, troubled murmur that cut through the polite whispers of the departing nobles. It was not news of the war, but something closer, something within their own walls. A guardsman had been arrested, accused of treason by a rival courtier, but this was no ordinary soldier. The report spoke of a feral, untamable strength, of a defiance so profound it had silenced the entire dungeon. The captain spoke his name, a common, forgettable name, Kalen. Yet something in the description of his cold, predatory eyes made Seraphina's blood run cold. A new piece had just been placed on the board. The name Kalen was a rough, unpolished stone dropped into the placid waters of her court. It unsettled her. The description of his untamable presence in the dungeons stirred something ancient and forgotten within her, a feeling that predated crowns and councils. That night, sleep offered no refuge. Seraphina found herself before the grand portraits of her parents in the silent gallery. the painted eyes of the late king and queen following her every move. She wasn't just their daughter, she was their living legacy, the vessel for all their unfinished work. Their assassination hadn't just been an act of political violence, it had been the shattering of her world, an event that had ripped the heart from her chest and replaced it with a cold, heavy scepter. She was 10 years old when they placed the crown on her head, its weight a physical manifestation of a grief she was never allowed to process. Her primary wound wasn't the visible scar of their loss, but the invisible, festering agony of abandonment. They had left her. They had left her to navigate this treacherous court alone, to face an encroaching empire with nothing but a child's courage and a borrowed name of Iron Queen. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, she would whisper her resentment to their unlistening portraits, a bitter confession of her fear and loneliness. She was supposed to be the embodiment of their strength, but she felt like a pale imitation, a ghost haunting a throne that was never meant for her. This crushing weight of their expectations was a constant, suffocating presence, a reminder that her failure would not only doom her kingdom, but also tarnish the memory of the parents she barely had time to know. Because of this, romance was a fairy tale she had long since discarded, a foolish dream for girls who had the luxury of a heart to give. In Eldoria's court, love was a currency, and marriage was a contract. She had watched ambitious lords and ladies wield affection like a weapon, their gentle whispers and soft touches concealing daggers of political intent. To love, to trust someone so completely, would be to hand her enemies the key to her own destruction. So, she had meticulously built a fortress around her heart, its walls made of duty and its mortar mixed with the bitter memory of betrayal. A queen could not afford the vulnerability of love. She could not afford to be seen as a woman. She was a symbol, a shield, an unbreachable wall, and she would allow no one close enough to see the cracks. The daily council meetings were a testament to her isolation. The nobles, led by the perpetually scheming Lord Valerius, treated her with a cloying, condescending respect that was more insulting than open defiance. They would listen to her strategies, their faces masks of polite consideration, before offering their own wiser counsel, always framing her youth as a liability. Each session was a performance, a grueling test of her composure as she parried their veiled insults and deflected their attempts to usurp her authority. She would sit on the onyx throne, her posture perfect, her expression unreadable, while inside a silent scream of frustration and rage built. She was their queen, yet she had to fight for every ounce of respect, constantly proving she was more than the orphaned girl they wished to control. She would never forget the moment her resolve was forged into true iron. Weeks after her coronation, overwhelmed and terrified, she had sought out General Theron, her father's oldest friend and a man she had once called uncle. In the privacy of his study, she had let her mask slip, her voice trembling as she confessed her fears. She had expected solace, a moment of shared grief. Instead, he had looked at her with cold disappointment, his words a brutal slap. He told her that a queen had no right to tears, that her feelings were a poison that would weaken the kingdom. He instructed her to bury the girl, to kill the part of her that felt, and to become the unfeeling monarch Eldoria needed to survive. That rejection, from the one person she thought she could trust, was the final blow. In the solitude of her chambers, looking out over the sprawling city lights, Seraphina allowed herself to dream, but her dreams were not of a handsome prince or a grand romance. They were simple, humble fantasies of a life she could never have. She dreamed of walking through a crowded market, her face hidden by a commoner's cloak, free to taste roasted nuts from a vendor's stall without a royal taster. She dreamed of feeling the rain on her face without a guard to shield her, of having a single thought that wasn't weighed down by the fate of millions. This secret yearning for anonymity, for a single moment of unburdened freedom, was her most profound and painful secret. It was the soft, vulnerable heart she protected beneath layers of iron, the part of her that was still just a girl in a gilded cage. The name of the prisoner, Lycan, continued to echo in the hollows of her mind, a strange and disruptive frequency. The captain's report on his feral defiance, his cold and unbroken stare, sparked a desperate, reckless idea. Her armies were failing, her council was plotting, and her kingdom was bleeding. Conventional solutions were no longer enough. She needed a weapon, a force of nature that the Empire would not anticipate. Standing abruptly, her decision settled like a stone in her gut. She would see this prisoner herself, as if summoned by her very thought. A timid knock sounded at her door. A young page entered, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. "Your Majesty," he stammered, bowing low. "The Lord Warden from the dungeons sends an urgent message. The prisoner, he is asking to see you. En este canal traigo las historias de romance más épicas e intensas. Cada semana, un nuevo mundo, una nueva pasión imposible." The message traveled from the dungeon's depths like a tremor, unsettling the polished marble floors of the palace. The Lord Warden, a man whose face was a permanent mask of grim duty, delivered the news himself. The prisoner, Lycan, was not broken. He was not pleading. In the suffocating darkness of the deepest cell, surrounded by the stench of despair and damp stone, he sat in chains as if upon a throne. The other prisoners cowered away from him. The guards spoke of him in hushed, fearful tones. They said his stillness was more terrifying than any roar, his eyes holding the cold, ancient light of a winter star. He had spoken only once since his incarceration, his voice a low rumble that promised violence, and it was not a request for mercy. It was a demand for an audience with the Queen. He sat on the cold stone floor, the iron manacles on his wrists a familiar, hateful weight. Lycan was a king in rags, a wolf in a sheep's pen, and this gilded cage of Eldoria was the most suffocating prison he had ever known. He had watched this kingdom from the inside, serving as a nameless guardsman, his true identity, a secret he guarded more fiercely than any fortress. He saw in their bowing lords and whispering ladies the same rot that had consumed his own people: politics over strength, civility over truth. His throne in the wildlands was now nothing but a pile of scorched stones, his pack scattered to the winds by an empire that had used such political weakness to its advantage. He had come here seeking anonymity, a place to let his grief fester in peace. But fate, it seemed, was a cruel and relentless hunter. Beneath the layers of cynicism and the carefully constructed mask of indifference, a profound loneliness gnawed at him. More than the crown, he missed the feeling of the earth beneath his bare feet, the shared heartbeat of his pack running under the full moon. That was true power, a primal connection to the world that these humans, with their silks and schemes, could never comprehend. His greatest fear, the one that haunted his waking moments, was not the executioner's axe. It was the terror of being forgotten, of his lineage ending here in a squalid cell, his name fading into a traitor's footnote. The feral power within him, the legacy of his Lycan blood, coiled in his gut like a starved beast, begging for release, for a battle worthy of its fury. The charge of treason was an absurd irony. He, who had lost everything to betrayal, was now accused of it by a preening courtier he wouldn't have deemed worthy of cleaning his boots. This was the ultimate humiliation. The pressure was not from the chains, but from the choice they represented. He could die here, a ghost, his secret safe, or he could unleash the truth, a desperate, final roar to announce his existence before the end. He chose the latter. Asking to see the Queen was not a plea, it was a gamble. It was the move of a king cornered on the board, knocking over all the pieces to see what would happen. He would force her hand, make her look him in the eye and see the man, the king, she was about to discard. He knew of Seraphina only by her title, the Iron Queen. He had seen her from afar in the throne room, a beautiful, cold statue of a girl playing at being a ruler, surrounded by wolves of her own. He felt nothing but contempt for her and the fragile power she represented. In his world, leadership was earned in blood and bone, not inherited. He believed she was weak, propped up by tradition and fear, and he intended to shatter that illusion. He would show her a glimpse of the real power that stirred in the shadows of her kingdom, a power she and her council had foolishly ignored. He did not know that her need was as desperate as his own, that behind her iron mask was a terror that mirrored the ghost of his own lost kingdom. The warden's report left a chill in Seraphina's chambers that had nothing to do with the evening air. A condemned man did not make demands. He begged, yet every detail of the report painted a picture not of a criminal, but of a caged predator. His quiet defiance, his unnerving calm, his singular demand to see her, it all resonated with the strange, inexplicable pull his name had on her from the very beginning. Her mind screamed that it was a trap, a ploy by her enemies to lure her into a vulnerable position. Lord Valerius would surely use such a reckless act against her, but a deeper instinct, a queen's intuition she was only just beginning to trust, told her that this moment was a hinge upon which her entire future, and the future of Eldoria, would swing. She would go. She would face this beast in his den and discover the truth, even if it cost her everything. The air grew colder and heavier with each stone step she descended, the scent of damp earth, despair, and old blood clinging to her velvet cloak. The torchlight cast long, dancing shadows that seemed to mock her royal composure, twisting the grim faces of the guards into monstrous masks. They followed at a distance, their fear of the prisoner a palpable thing in the suffocating silence of the dungeon's lowest level. Seraphina kept her chin high, her spine a rod of iron, but a tremor of primal unease coiled in her gut. She was walking toward the unknown, toward a man whose defiance was said to be a force of nature. When she finally reached the end of the corridor, she saw him. He wasn't pacing or rattling his chains. He was sitting in the center of his cell, a figure of absolute stillness, watching her approach as if he had been expecting her all along. Si este tipo de historias te atrapan, suscríbete porque tengo muchas más. Separated by the cold, thick bars of the cell, the Iron Queen and the caged wolf finally met. He did not rise. He simply tilted his head, his eyes a startling, piercing shade of grey like a winter storm, raking over her from the crown on her head to the hem of her gown. There was no fear in his gaze, only a cold, calculating assessment that stripped away her title and saw the woman beneath. Seraphina felt the look like a physical touch, an invasion that threatened the walls she had so carefully constructed. She held his stare, refusing to be the first to look away, channeling every ounce of her royal authority into her posture. The air between them crackled with a tension that was more than just animosity. It was the collision of two apex predators, each recognizing the power and the danger in the other. He was a storm held in check by iron, and she was the mountain that refused to yield. Her voice, when she spoke, was the cut of glacial ice. "The condemned do not summon their queen," she stated, the words echoing slightly in the stone chamber. "You have one chance to explain this audacity before I return to the surface and forget your name entirely." A low, humorless sound, more a rumble in his chest than a laugh, answered her. He finally shifted, the movement fluid and powerful despite his chains. "You call this a kingdom?" he countered, his voice a gravelly timbre that vibrated through the stone floor. "I see a gilded cage, ruled by a girl who mistakes fear for respect. You came down here not because of my audacity, but because of your desperation. You can smell the smoke on the wind, just as I can. Your kingdom is dying, and you know it." His words were a direct assault, aimed not at her crown, but at the secret terror in her heart. Serafina's composure was a flawless mask of indifference, but inside, his words had struck their mark. "And what would a common traitor know of kingdoms?" She shot back, her tone sharp. He finally rose to his feet, a towering, intimidating presence that seemed to shrink the confines of the cell. The torchlight caught the hard lines of his face as he stepped closer to the bars. I am no common traitor," he snarled, the sound feral and raw. "My name is Kalen, and I am the last true king of the Lycan clans." The revelation hit her with the force of a physical blow. Lycan, the mythical beastmen her generals dismissed as folklore, the savage warriors whispered to be more myth than reality. "My people were shattered by the same empire that now scratches at your door," he continued, his voice laced with a bitter, ancient grief. "They left me a king with no throne, and you a queen with no army." The world tilted on its axis. Lycan. The word reconfigured every political calculation, every military strategy she had painstakingly devised. He wasn't a madman. The raw, untamed power radiating from him was too real, too potent to be a lie. This was the weapon she had been searching for, a force of primal magic her enemies would never anticipate. Her mind spun, a whirlwind of opportunity and catastrophic risk. To unleash such a force could save Eldoria, but what would be the cost? How could she control a king of beasts, a man whose very nature was the antithesis of her ordered world? He was chaos incarnate, a wild card that could either win her the war or tear her kingdom apart from the inside. The desperation he had accused her of was a cold, hard truth, and it was telling her that this monstrous, impossible gamble was the only one she had left to make. He saw the frantic calculation in her eyes, the flicker of hope warring with fear. He pressed his advantage. "Your soldiers fight with steel and die on open fields," Kalen said, his voice low and intense, his hands gripping the bars between them. "My people are the forest, the shadows, the storm. We are a tide of fang and claw that will wash over your enemies and leave nothing but bones. I can summon them. I can unite the scattered packs under a single banner. Your banner." He paused, letting the weight of his offer settle in the charged silence. "But they will not bleed for the queen who holds their king in chains. Free me. Give me a place at your side, not as a subject, but as an ally. Do this, and you will have your army. Refuse, and you can watch Eldoria burn from the ramparts of your castle." It was not a plea. It was an ultimatum. Serafina stared at him, at the raw power and fierce pride burning in his storm-grey eyes. An ally. The word was too fragile, too temporary. An alliance could be broken the moment the war was won, leaving her with a victorious and untethered Lycan king on her borders. Her nobles, led by Valerius, would use such a partnership to brand her a sympathizer of beasts, to undermine her authority and stage a coup. No, she needed more than an alliance. She needed an unbreakable chain. She needed to bind him to Eldoria so completely that his survival was intrinsically linked to hers. Her answer had to be a move so bold, so utterly unthinkable, that it would silence all dissent through sheer shock. A cold, ruthless clarity washed over her. She would not just unshackle him. She would place a gilded collar around his neck, one he could never remove. "Your terms are unacceptable," Serafina said, her voice dropping to a calm, deliberate tone that made the guards behind her shift uneasily. Kalen's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing in their depths. "I am not here to bargain, Your Majesty." "Neither am I," she replied, taking a step closer to the bars, her gaze unwavering. "I will not grant you freedom, Kalen of the Lycans. I will grant you a crown." A flicker of stunned disbelief, the first genuine crack in his iron control, crossed his face. "Would I will annul your sentence and raise you from this cell," she continued, her voice ringing with absolute authority. "You will stand beside me not as an ally, but as my husband, my king consort. You will bind your people to my kingdom through a sacred, unbreakable vow. That is my price for your life. Marry me, and you will give me my army." The silence in the dungeon was a living thing, thick and heavy with the weight of her proposal. Kaelan stared at her through the bars, the initial shock on his face hardening into a look of cold, predatory calculation. He saw the trap in her offer, the gilded cage she was building for him, but he also saw the glint of his only path to survival. A slow, dangerous smile touched his lips, a baring of teeth that was anything but humorous. "You would chain a wolf to your throne and call him a pet," he rasped. "Very well, your majesty. I accept your proposal." He pushed himself off the stone floor, his presence filling the cell. "But understand this. This is a pact between kings. I will be your weapon, but I will never be your subject. My people will answer to me, and me alone. That is my price for this crown you offer." The announcement struck the royal council like a bolt of lightning. Seraphina stood before the onyx throne, not upon it. A deliberate choice to place herself on even footing with the man beside her. Kaelan, now cleaned and dressed in the severe black and silver of the Eldorian royal house, looked utterly out of place, a wild storm contained in a velvet coat. His presence alone was an act of defiance. When Seraphina declared their impending marriage, the chamber erupted. Lord Valerius's face contorted in a mask of apoplectic rage, while others shouted their protests, calling it madness. Seraphina let the chaos swell for a moment before she raised a single hand. An instant, chilling silence fell. "This is not a debate," she said, her voice like ice. "It is a command. You will welcome your new king." The ceremony was a stark, brutal affair, devoid of any pretense of celebration. It was held in the great hall, the air thick with tension and the scent of melting wax from the heavy candelabras. The highest nobles of the court stood as grim witnesses, their faces a mixture of fear and morbid curiosity. The priest, his voice trembling slightly, rushed through the rites as if eager to be done with the blasphemous union. Seraphina stood tall and unmoving, a statue carved from ice, while Kaelan watched the proceedings with a cynical, detached amusement. This was not a wedding. It was the formalization of a treaty, an exchange of prisoners where the chains were made of gold and sacred vows. Every person in that room knew they were witnessing history, but they feared it was the beginning of the end. Their vows were not promises of love, but articles of a contract. "I, Queen Seraphina of Eldoria," she began, her voice ringing with cold authority, "do take you, Kaelan of the Lycan clans, as my king consort. I vow to grant your people sanctuary and recognize your sovereignty over them under the banner of my kingdom." He met her gaze, his own voice a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the hall. "And I, Kaelan, king of the Lycans, do take you as my queen. I vow to summon the scattered packs and bind their strength to Eldoria's shield, to be its fang and its claw, until our common enemy is vanquished." It was a declaration of war spoken in the language of marriage, a promise of bloodshed sealed before a holy altar. When it came time to exchange rings, a page brought forth a velvet cushion. On it sat a single band of black iron, stark and severe, forged for a warrior king. Seraphina took it, her fingers brushing his as she slid it onto his hand. The contact was like a spark of lightning, a brief, shocking jolt of heat. Kaelan had no ring to give her. Instead, in a move that made the entire court gasp, he reached out and gently took a strand of her dark hair. With deft, surprisingly gentle fingers, he wove it into a small, intricate braid just behind her ear. It was a primal, possessive gesture from his world, a claim far more intimate than any jewel. For a moment, Seraphina forgot to breathe, stunned by the unexpected proprietary touch against her skin. "You may seal this sacred union," the priest stammered, his eyes wide. The entire court held its breath. This was the final seal on this impossible pact. Kalen turned to face her fully, his storm-grey eyes locking onto hers. He didn't ask for permission. He cupped her face in his large, warm hand, his thumb brushing the frantic pulse in her throat. He lowered his head and claimed her lips. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a brand. It was possessive, demanding, a silent declaration to every watching lord and lady that she was now his. It was a kiss that tasted of the wild, of winter storms and ancient forests, and it was over in a heartbeat, leaving Seraphina's lips tingling and her mind reeling in the sudden, shocking silence of the hall. For that one terrifying second, the Iron Queen ceased to exist. All her training, all her carefully constructed walls of ice and duty, shattered into a million pieces. There was only the firm, demanding pressure of his lips and the shocking warmth of his hand holding her face, anchoring her in a reality that had suddenly become intensely, frighteningly physical. She felt the raw power he held in check, the feral energy thrumming just beneath his skin, and it both terrified and fascinated her. When he pulled away, she forced her expression back into a mask of regal indifference, but inside, her carefully ordered world had been thrown into chaos. She had chained a beast to her throne, and she had just felt the first searing heat of his fire. "Dei like si ya te enganchaste, y suscríbete para más romances épicos." The aftermath in the Great Hall was a silent storm of shock and recalculation. Lord Valerius's face was a study in controlled fury. His carefully laid plans to manipulate and control a lonely girl queen had just been incinerated. He now faced not just a queen, but a queen with a savage king at her side, an unpredictable and dangerous piece on the board he could not control. The other nobles shifted uneasily, their whispers dying in their throats. They looked from their serene queen to the formidable brooding man beside her, and a new, unwelcome understanding dawned. The power dynamic of Eldoria had not just shifted, it had been fundamentally broken and reforged in the space of a single ceremony. Fear had a new face in the court, and it wore a crown of black iron. Later, the heavy oak doors of the royal apartments closed behind them, shutting out the world and sealing them in an opulent, suffocating silence. The air crackled with an unspoken tension that was far more potent than the open hostility of the court. They were now husband and wife, a king and queen bound together, yet they were more estranged than any two strangers on the street. Kalen began to prowl the perimeter of the lavish room, his powerful form a dark, menacing shadow against the silk and gold. He looked like a wolf, trapped in a jewelry box. Seraphina walked to the far window, turning her back on him. Her spine ramrod straight as she stared, unseeing, at the city lights below. She felt more imprisoned in this room with him than she ever had in her entire life. He stopped his restless pacing directly behind her. She didn't have to see him to feel him. The heat radiating from his body was a palpable presence, raising the fine hairs on her arms. "This changes nothing," she said, her voice a low, determined whisper aimed at her own reflection in the glass. "This is a political arrangement, a contract." The silence stretched, thick and heavy, before his voice came, a deep rumble right next to her ear that sent a shiver down her spine. "You are mistaken, little queen," he murmured, his words a soft, dangerous promise. "You thought you could command a storm. You will learn that a storm is not commanded. It is not contained." He didn't touch her, but his words were a caress and a threat. A vow that their union would be anything but a simple contract. The days that followed were a carefully choreographed play of power and distance. They shared meals in the great hall, a king and queen of ice and shadow, their every polite exchange scrutinized by the hawk-eyed court. Seraphina would watch him from the corner of her eye, marveling at how he managed to make the finest silks look like a barbarian's furs, and the gilded throne room feel like a cage. He ate with a focused, predatory stillness that was a stark contrast to the nobles' delicate maneuvering of their silverware. He never spoke unless spoken to, but his silence was a living thing, a palpable force that filled the room and made everyone else's chatter seem frivolous and weak. It was a constant, unnerving reminder of the wild storm she had leashed to her side, and she couldn't decide if his presence was a comfort or a threat. Their fragile truce was tested daily. During a formal tour of the royal gardens, Kaelin eschewed the manicured gravel paths, instead walking on the grass, his boots sinking into the soft earth. When Lord Valerius made a snide remark about his lack of decorum, Kaelin simply stopped and inhaled deeply. "You can smell the rain coming," he stated, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Your gardeners should cover the winter roses." The nobles tittered at his rustic pronouncement, but Seraphina felt a strange pang. He wasn't seeing a garden, he was reading the world in a language she had long forgotten. Later that evening, a sudden, violent downpour lashed the castle, just as he had predicted. It was a small thing, but it was a demonstration of a power that had nothing to do with crowns or titles, and it unsettled her more than any open defiance. Late one night, unable to sleep, Seraphina was in the war room, staring at the maps that detailed the slow, inexorable advance of the Empire's forces. The weight of it all was a physical ache in her bones. She didn't hear him enter, but she felt the shift in the air. Kaelin stood in the doorway, watching her. He walked to the map, his large finger tracing the enemy lines with a surprising gentleness. "You look at the map," he said, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "You see borders and armies. You need to see the land, the rivers that swell in the spring, the mountain passes that freeze in winter. Nature is your greatest ally if you know how to ask for its help." He wasn't offering military strategy, he was offering a different way of seeing, a perspective born from survival, not theory. For the first time, she felt a flicker of genuine respect. The council meeting was a viper's pit. Lord Valerius, emboldened by the court's unease, launched a direct assault on her authority. "Your Majesty," he began, his voice dripping with false concern, "your unorthodox marital arrangement has sent a wave of instability through the kingdom. The people whisper that you have allied us with a beast. They question your judgment, your fitness to rule. They say you are a frightened girl making desperate choices." The words were a public flogging, each one designed to strip away her power and expose her as a fraud. Seraphina gripped the arms of the onyx throne, her knuckles white, her face a perfect, unreadable mask of iron. She could feel Kaelin's gaze on her, a burning intensity from his seat beside the throne, but she did not dare to look at him. Kaelin sat in silence, a statue of coiled fury. He had faced down charging beasts and rival alphas, but the venom in this room was a different kind of poison. He watched the smug, preening lords dissect his queen, their words like tiny, sharp knives aimed at her pride. He saw the almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw, the rigid straightness of her spine, the sheer force of will it took for her to not shatter before them. He had seen her as a cold, calculating politician who had used him as a pawn. But now he saw a lone wolf surrounded by a pack of hyenas, fighting to protect her territory with nothing but her own courage. A fierce, unfamiliar surge of protectiveness, hot and raw, flooded his veins. They were not just insulting a queen, they were insulting his queen. The breaking point came during the formal reception for a visiting dignitary. As Seraphina was engaged in a tense diplomatic exchange, Lord Valerius approached, positioning himself to be overheard. "One must pity the kingdom," he sighed to a neighboring lord, his voice carrying clearly, "ruled by a child's whims and protected by her pet monster." Before Seraphina could even form a response, Kaelan moved. He wasn't loud or violent. He simply rose to his full, intimidating height and stepped in front of Valerius, blocking him from view. "The king," Kaelan growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that vibrated through the marble floor, "does not appreciate insects buzzing near his queen." The entire hall fell silent. Valerius paled, taking an involuntary step back. Kaelan hadn't touched him, but it was a public execution of his status, a brutal and undeniable show of force. The silence that followed was absolute. Every noble, every servant, every guard stared, their faces a mixture of shock and newfound fear. Kaelan had not raised his voice, but his threat hung in the air like the blade of a guillotine. He turned his back on the trembling Valerius and returned to Seraphina's side, his presence a dark, unbreachable wall. He had single-handedly redrawn the lines of power in the court. He had made it clear that an attack on her was an attack on him, and he was a far more dangerous enemy than a young queen. Seraphina stood frozen for a heartbeat, her mind reeling. He had defended her, not as an ally fulfilling a contract, but as a king defending his territory. The act was so raw, so primal, it sent a dizzying, terrifying thrill right through her. Later, in the privacy of their chambers, the silence was a living entity between them. "You didn't have to do that," Seraphina said finally, her voice barely a whisper. She was standing by the fire, refusing to look at him. It was unseemly. Kaelan came to stand behind her, so close she could feel the heat of his body. "He dishonored you," he stated, as if it were the simplest fact in the world. "And you are my queen. My honor is bound to yours." She turned to face him, searching his stormy eyes for the politician, the strategist. She found none. "Was that part of our bargain?" she challenged. He held her gaze, a flicker of something unreadable in their depths. "No," he admitted, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "It was not." And in that moment, the line between their pact and something real blurred into nothing. The dynamic between them began to shift in the quiet moments. One afternoon, he found her in the royal library, attempting to decipher an ancient Lycan text. Frustrated, she was about to give up when he sat beside her, his large frame seeming to shrink the cavernous room. Without a word, he began to translate the runes, his voice a low murmur as he explained the old legends, the stories of his ancestors. In return, she found herself telling him about her father, about the weight of his legacy. They were no longer just a queen and her weapon. They were two lonely sovereigns, sharing the crushing burden of their crowns. As he spoke of the moon and the hunt, she looked at the fierce king beside her, and a dangerous thought surfaced. Are we even pretending anymore? Their fragile new understanding was complicated by the arrival of an envoy from a neighboring kingdom, a handsome, charming prince with clear political ambitions. During a state dinner, the prince was relentless in his flattery of Seraphina, his hand lingering on her arm a moment too long, his compliments laced with innuendo. From across the table, Kaelan watched, his face a mask of stone, but his eyes were chips of ice. When the prince leaned in to whisper something in Seraphina's ear, Kaelan's fork snapped in his hand with a sharp crack that silenced the table. The prince recoiled as if struck. Kaelan said nothing, but his message was brutally clear. It was a raw, possessive act that had nothing to do with politics, and it sent a confusing, forbidden warmth spreading through Seraphina's chest. Just as they were beginning to navigate the treacherous terrain of their new relationship, an urgent message arrived, carried by a rider caked in mud and exhaustion. It was from the Lycan packs Kaelan had summoned. They had gathered in the northern forests, a formidable army of shadows and claws. But their loyalty was conditional. The alpha of the largest clan, a grizzled old wolf named Fenrir, refused to pledge his warriors to a human queen he had never seen. He demanded she prove her worthiness not through treaties or crowns, but through the old ways. He was invoking the rite of the hunt, a sacred Lycan ceremony, to test the strength and courage of a new alpha's mate. It was a challenge, a political threat, wrapped in ancient tradition. The rite was explained to her in stark, uncompromising terms. It was not a symbolic gesture. She would be taken deep into the heart of the ancient forest, the Lycan's most sacred territory, with only Kaelin at her side. There, under the light of the full moon, they would have to hunt and kill a shadow cat, a massive, notoriously cunning predator that even seasoned Lycan warriors feared. Success would bind the packs to her, forging an unbreakable loyalty. Failure, however, would mean not just the loss of her army, but likely her life. It was an impossible test, designed to break her. As Kaelin watched her, his expression grim, Seraphina knew she had no choice. To refuse was to admit weakness and lose everything. Her answer would seal the fate of her kingdom and her own. The journey into the ancient heart of the northern woods was a descent into another world, a realm governed by laws older than any human kingdom. The air grew thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the silence was a living thing, broken only by the rustle of unseen creatures. For the first time, Seraphina felt the true chasm between their worlds. Here, she was not a queen, she was an intruder, a fragile creature of silk and steel in a world of claw and instinct. Kaelin moved through the forest with a preternatural grace, his senses alive, his body a part of the landscape. But a new, colder distance had settled between them. He was no longer the reluctant king or the unexpected defender. He was the alpha, guiding a liability through his territory, and his silence was a wall of stone she could not breach. They made camp as twilight bled through the canopy, the fire a small circle of warmth against the encroaching dark. The tension, which had simmered all day, finally boiled over. "Why are you treating me this way?" Seraphina demanded, her voice sharp in the quiet. "As if I am a burden you are forced to carry?" Kaelin didn't look at her, his attention fixed on sharpening a hunting knife. "Because you are," he answered, his voice flat and cold. "You walk into my world demanding my people's blood, waving a crown as if it has meaning here. This rite is not a performance for your court. Fenrir is not testing your courage. He is testing my judgment. If you fail, if you show a moment of weakness, I will not just lose an army for you. I will lose the right to call myself their king. You are risking everything I have left on a political gamble." His words were a slap, but they were born of a truth she hadn't considered. The weight of his sacrifice, the true depth of what he was risking, settled on her like a shroud. And beneath it, the guilt of her own secret festered. "It's more than a gamble," she confessed, her voice cracking, the sound alien in the wild silence. "There is something you don't know." He finally looked up, his grey eyes piercing her in the firelight. "The council," she began, the words tasting like poison. "They never truly accepted our pact. They gave me an ultimatum. If you could not rally the Lycan army and have them pledged to Eldoria by the third full moon, they would have our marriage annulled, and you would be executed for failing to uphold your end of the bargain." She finally met his gaze. "That tonight is the third full moon." The knife fell from Kaelin's hand, clattering against the stones. A profound, deathly stillness came over him. The betrayal was absolute, a clean, devastating blow to the heart of the fragile trust they had built. Every shared glance, every quiet moment of understanding was instantly recontextualized as a lie. He was not her husband, not her king. He was a condemned man on a stay of execution, and she was his warden. He rose to his feet, a figure of pure, cold fury. "So this entire time," he said, his voice a low, dangerous whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "while I defended you, while I taught you, while I stood by your side, I was simply a tool with a deadline, a beast to be put down if it failed to perform its trick. The accusation hung between them, suffocating the air. He took a step toward her, and for the first time, she saw the true predator in his eyes, untempered by respect or affection. He saw her flinch and stopped, a bitter, humorless smile twisting his lips. "Was any of it real?" he asked, the question a shard of ice. "The way you looked at me in the library? The way you stood a little closer after I dealt with Valerius? Or were you just ensuring your weapon remained sharp and pointed in the right direction?" She couldn't answer. The truth was a tangled mess of duty, fear, and a terrifying, nascent feeling she couldn't name. To admit she had lied to protect him from the council's plotting felt like another manipulation. To say nothing was to confirm his worst fears. Her silence was his answer, and she watched the last flicker of warmth in his eyes die out, replaced by the cold, hard grey of a winter storm. "It was real," she finally whispered to his back as he turned away, the confession lost in the vastness of the forest. "Everything I felt was real. I was a coward. I was afraid to tell you because I knew. I knew you would look at me exactly as you are looking at me now." He didn't turn around. The chasm between them was no longer political or cultural. It was a wound, deep and poisoned by her deception. The right of the hunt was no longer a test of worthiness. It was a desperate, final act in a tragedy of their own making. They faced the Shadow Cat in the dead of night, not as a united pair, but as two broken sovereigns, fighting side by side in a silence more profound than any roar. Their victory was a hollow, bitter thing, securing an army for a kingdom whose rulers had just declared war on each other. The great hall was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Nobles, council members, and the grim-faced Lycan alphas, led by Fenrir, filled the chamber, the air thick with suspicion. Lord Valerius, his face a mask of triumphant malice, stood before the onyx throne and delivered the killing blow. He held aloft a scroll, the secret decree Seraphina had signed. "Here is the truth of your new king," he boomed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "He is not an ally, but a condemned man on borrowed time. Our queen made a pact not of unity, but of extortion. If his army did not appear, her own order was to see him executed." He threw the scroll at the base of the throne. "She is a tyrant who used a beast as a tool. I call for her abdication and his arrest." A wave of gasps and furious murmurs swept the room as the fragile alliance threatened to shatter into open warfare. Before the chaos could erupt, Seraphina rose from her throne. Her iron mask was gone, replaced by a raw, devastating vulnerability that stunned the hall into silence. "He is right," she said, her voice clear and steady, yet stripped of all its regal artifice. "I did write that decree." She descended the steps, her gaze fixed on Kalen, seeing only him in the crowded room. "I wrote it out of fear. I have been a queen since I was a child, but I have been alone for every single moment of it. I was surrounded by enemies in my own home and an empire at my gates, and I was drowning. The desperation he saw in my eyes in that dungeon was real. I made a monster's bargain because I was too afraid to trust the one person who showed me true strength. I lied to him and to all of you because I was a coward." All eyes turned to Kalen. This was his moment of vindication, his chance for revenge. Lord Valerius watched with a smug, predatory grin, certain the wolf was about to turn on his tamer. The Lycan alphas tensed, their hands straying to their weapons, awaiting the command from their king to tear this court apart. Kalen moved, but not toward Valerius. He walked slowly, deliberately, through the sea of parted nobles until he stood before Seraphina. The silence was so profound it was a physical weight. He looked down at her, at the unshed tears glistening in her eyes, and saw not the queen who had condemned him, but the woman who had just bared her soul. He reached out, and with a startling gentleness, his calloused thumb brushed away a single tear from her cheek. "A coward," he rumbled, his voice filling the hall, does not walk into a wolf's den to save her people. That is a queen. He then took her hand, his fingers lacing with hers in an unbreakable grip, and turned to face the stunned assembly. This alliance was born of fear, Kaelin declared, his voice ringing with the absolute authority of a king. But it has been forged in the fire of truth. Lord Valerius speaks of bargains, I speak of loyalty. His gaze swept over the Lycan alphas, a silent command that was instantly understood. My loyalty is not to a contract that was burned the moment it was signed. It is to my queen. He raised their joined hands high for all to see. The Pax do not fight for Eldoria's council. We fight for our kingdom, and for the queen who was brave enough to unite it. He turned back to Seraphina, and in front of the entire world, he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a brand or a claim, but a vow, a tender, soul-deep promise that sealed their union forever. The silence of peace settled over Eldoria like the first winter snow, soft and absolute. The onyx throne no longer felt like a circlet of ice, but a seat warmed by two hearts beating as one. In the quiet gardens, a king taught a queen how to read the language of the wind, and in return, she taught him how to feel the sun again. Esta historia termina, pero hay muchas más esperándote. La próxima semana, a sorceress queen bound to a cursed knight enfrentará algo aún más peligroso. A love that could unravel reality itself. The war was won, its victory cementing a legend that would be whispered for centuries, the story of the Iron Queen and her Wolf King. Lord Valerius's treachery became a bitter footnote in the grand tale of their reign. Standing on the highest parapet of the castle, they looked out over a kingdom that was finally whole, a land of men and Lycans living under one banner. Kaelin came to stand behind Seraphina, wrapping his arms around her as his hand came to rest protectively over her stomach. A silent, shared secret of the new life they had created, a new heir who would carry the strength of both their worlds. Dale, like si esta historia te atrapó. Suscríbete para la próxima. Comenta qué momento te impactó más. Their two broken crowns, finally remade into one.